Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a comprehensive guide on the next best deck in Standard, and that is GANDEEVA. GANDEEVA has shown so many results in Japan and has finally dropped in English come set 10. So this is definitely a comprehensive guide that you guys should definitely tune in for, because this will tell you essentially how to build the deck, how to play it, and some of the weaknesses and I guess the strengths of the deck going into the metagame. If you guys need any coaching though, feel free to hit me up on Metafy. I'll post a link in my description. BCS is coming up and I will have a promotion in the next couple of weeks or so. Feel free to book a session and we can get started on your BCS season. So starting off with the ride line. The ride line is very unique. This ride line is probably not the ride line I would go for, but I want to make this video as simple as possible for anyone who opens DBT10 and can build GANDEEVA straight out of the box. So we're playing the GANDEEVA ride line. The grade 1 essentially says when you're trying to ride into the grade 2, then you can ride for free if your opponent has 2 or less rear guards. But otherwise, sorry, 1 or less rear guards. And then if they have 2 or more rear guards, then when you ditch to ride the grade 2, then you can call the grade 1 out. The ride line that I would use is the Saga ride line, and I'll explain that a little bit later in the video, just kind of dictating what cards to take out. But if you're, a new player going into set 10, playing this ride line is completely fine. The grade 2 skill is that when GANDEEVA rides over the grade 2, GANDEEVA's +1 cost for the act ability is nullified essentially, or omitted. Now GANDEEVA, the star of the show, each time your opponent's rear guard is bound, you can choose, retired, you can bind one of the cards in your drop zone face down. Now the whole purpose of this deck is that the more cards you have face down in the bind zone, the stronger your field gets. Because of the second ability, during your turn, all your front row rear guards gain plus 2k for each face down card in the bind zone. And if you have 5 or more, this unit gains a crit. And then the act skill is CB1, choose 5 of your opponent's rear guards with different grades, and then reveal the top 5, retire all of the chosen units with the same grades as the cards revealed in terms of the grade. And then shuffle your deck, and if 1 or less cards were retired, draw 1 and then bind 1 card from your drop face down. So essentially what this card says is that if you reveal a 0, 1 and 2 and you select a 0, 1 and 2 and 3 as well on your opponent's side of the field, you destroy them. And the best thing about this deck is that the longer the game goes, the more it scales. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. So that is the ride line. And just like every D deck that isn't a Stride deck set, we play 3 more GANDEEVAs. Persona Ride is so powerful in this deck just because the amount of power that you get from GANDEEVA itself is already good, and pretty much having a 10k front row buff off of Persona Ride is actually crazy. Then probably the next card is arguably the second most expensive card in the deck, and that is the Order, and this is called Best Harvest. So the skill is choose 1 of your Vanguard until the end of turn. When your opponent's rear guard is retired, you draw 1. So essentially you pair this with GANDEEVA and all of the other cards in the deck to retire, and each time you retire, draw 1. This deck means that you can afford to play more offensive triggers like fronts, because the draw power in this deck is actually ridiculous. So yep, for Best Harvest. And then the last card we run is 3 of the grade 3 support for GANDEEVA, so Sturgna. So when this is placed on rear guard, if you have a GANDEEVA Vanguard, Soul Blast 1, bind 1 of your other rear guards, or bind one of your other rear guards. Choose 1 of your opponent's rear guards to retire it. If you did not retire, draw 1, and then bind a card from your drop face down. The best thing about this is that it's a Soul Blast 1 to draw 1, so if you call it off 1 of your other grade 2s, which I'll explain in a second, you essentially draw 1. Otherwise, it's a retire, which is always good for a Soul Blast 1. This deck actually uses very little soul, so soul is a pretty, free resource to use. And yeah, that's what makes this deck so good. And yeah, so that is the grade 3s. Now moving on to the grade 2s, we have this card, Alphakar. Alphakar is your multi-attacker in this deck. So essentially when GANDEEVA attacks, +1, bind this face down. Look at the top 5, call a unit card that is grade 3 or less to rearguard. So essentially you can call this, you can call all your other stuff as well. There are some pretty nice cards to call in this deck. But yeah, this card is your multi-attacker in the deck. And multi-attacking is really good in this deck because essentially your front row gains +2k for each card bound face down. So yeah, that's pretty much that. Then the next card we have is Rugent. Essentially, when it's placed on rearguard, if you have a GANDEEVA Vanguard, +1, choose one of your opponent's rearguards and retire it. If you did not retire a card, draw 1 and bind a card from your drop zone face down. Just another way to retire, another way to proc Best Harvest. If there are cards on your opponent's field that you want to get rid of, so this is like selective retire instead of trying to gacha off that GANDEEVA skill. We only play 3 just because we want to make space for other stuff, and I'll just kind of dictate which cards are flex slots in this deck and which cards are, you know, able to be taken out. So that's Rugent. And then we play 2 of the cycler cards. The reason why we only play 2 is that essentially this deck allows you to ride up for free. Because from 1 to 2 it's free. So you're essentially only discarding this card for the grade 2. But more importantly, this card is essentially retiring a column and is very situational into certain matchups. Otherwise you're bombing your opponent's rearguards with all the other cards anyways. So this card is only good in certain matchups. Probably not Eva, because essentially Eva has retire protection, but anything that I guess you know, I guess protects a certain unit like resist, then you can bypass it by not targeting it and then retiring the column instead. So that's that. And then 2 Braccio Force. So this is the flex slot. So if you ever want to change this deck, this is probably the slot to change. There is another card in this deck that you can change as well. But I like Braccio Force. Braccio Force means that you can just commit it early and put the pressure onto your opponent. Because essentially if you're on hit with this card, you retire 1 and then you draw 1, so you refund the cost of playing this down on rearguard. But otherwise, yep, just a grade 2 that you can put in. You can substitute that for anything else. Yeah, very flexible in terms of what that card can do. Now next, grade 1s, 3 PGs, 1 Elementaria. I think we're all pretty used to that now. Elementaria is so good, and if you don't have Elementaria, feel free to substitute for the grade 1 PG. And then this card is so crazy, man. Like, back row rearguard circle, when your GANDEEVA attacks, if you have 3 or more bind, then bind this card face down and countercharge 1. This deck actually uses a lot of CB, so having this card to countercharge 1 is a blessing. So this card is probably one of your MVPs in this deck, along with your multi-attacker. And yeah, the fact that your multi-attacker can top 5 search for this is actually crazy. So that means that you set up for the next turn. Otherwise, if you hard draw into this, like try to use this like on, you know, a given turn so that you're in good shape for the next turn. Because I know that there's a lot of players where, you know, you call this off the grade 2 and then you essentially step into a retire and then this gets retired and it's wasted. This card is very valuable. Make sure you know, proc these on a pace. Don't over proc it obviously, because then you're losing resources, but yeah, this card is just so good. Allows you to countercharge 1, and you know, countercharge is always good. And then the last card is Brevania? Yeah. So this was inspired off Manlong's list, and I actually really like this card. Only playing 1 of it, because essentially it says at the end of battle, this unit boosted. If any player's rearguards were retired this turn, bind this unit face down and draw a card. This card is actually really good into the mirror, and to be honest, I would actually play more. But the fact that it boosts is kind of annoying. So it actually conflicts with this, because essentially you want to put this on a side rearguard But I guess like you can put this behind your Vanguard and don't feel bad. The reason why this is good in the mirror is that you remove your cards from the field. That means that your opponent's GANDEEVA, along with Best Harvest, will mean they will draw less, essentially. So yeah, this card is pretty cool. Again, this is a flex slot along with the 2 Brachio Force, so if you find that you want to play different cards, feel free to take this out, feel free to take Brachio Force out, and that's that. And then for triggers, pretty self-explanatory. 4 heals. You can play effect heals if you want. If you find that your meta is very crit orientated, yeah, play the crit heal. I think crit heal is pretty good in this meta game because you have GANDEEVA to worry about. Eva is still, you know, a good deck. Obviously, you know, Messiah kind of, you know, gets rid of Eva. But yeah, Eva will still be played because people will still retain it from the previous season. So I think having crit heals is actually pretty good in this deck. So swapping 2 out for 2 crit heals is completely fine. Then we're playing 4 fronts. 4 fronts in this deck is pretty crazy, especially if, like, you know, your front row is already buffed with like 2k times however many bind you have off the GANDEEVA skill, along with Persona Ride. And yeah, it's just super strong. Numbers are actually so crazy in this deck. You can hit like 50, 60Ks. Yeah, actually crazy. Then we play 8 crits and we play 8 vanilla crits. There's no real need to play the soul crit, just because the soul crit is just, yeah, you don't really need soul, and it makes really awkward numbers on some of your rear guards. So I think just having the 5k, having it good, yeah, on any given moment as a booster is much more valuable. And then 1 OT is good because OT is OT. So just recapping some of the stuff and I guess some of the changes that I would make. I would change the grade 1 ride line to the Bavsagra grade 1. And I would also change 1 Best Harvest to the sword or the shield for Bavsagra. So what's the reasoning behind that is that if you're riding a grade 1, that means that you're deck filtering 1 card. And people might say, hey Derek, come on, like deck filtering 1 card, it's just 1 card, like it's not gonna make a huge impact. Well, it will, right? The thing is that as much as people say that, you know, 1 card is like 2% of the deck, you're already starting on 46 cards. You take 5 out of your deck because that's your starting hand. So the 1 card that you take out is actually much higher than 2%. And that means that you are 2 or X% more likely to hit triggers and to hit the cards that you need. And also it's because the card that you search off this, well, off the ride line, it essentially is used as a, you know, a free discard anyways, which kind of serves the same purpose as the grade 1, except this grade 1 doesn't deck thin 1 card, whereas the Bavsagra line does. So I would swap the grade 1 to the Bavsagra grade 1 ride line, and then swapping 1 of the Best Harvests for the Sword or the Shield come from the trial deck. And then the next card I would change based on the metagame would be the Brachio Force and the Burnia. Now, if a lot of, if your metagame is full of Evas, then I would change the Brachio Force to Meteor Flare Dragon. Meteor Flare Dragon essentially says your opponent can't insert. That's pretty much the gist of it, which means that you lock out Eva of 20k shield. And that's really impactful just because Eva itself in the mid game is pretty slow and it doesn't have much to, I guess, like guard with, because the hand is like pretty smallish. So if you're, you know, locking out 20k shield, that might actually separate you from a win and a loss. So yeah, I would change these 2 to Meteor Flare. You don't really need 3, just because 3 is pretty excessive, and if you really want to see it, then sure. But I think 2 Meteor Flare is fine. And then the Burnia. If your metagame is full of GANDEEVA, which it probably will be come the BCS season, Burnia is actually a really good card to put in for the mirror, because essentially makes your field disappear. That's really, really important, because if your field disappears, then that means your opponent's best harvest, along with GANDEEVA's skill and some of the other skills in the deck, it makes it so that, you know, the matchup, you draw less, well, your opponent draws less, while you sustain your hand as it is. So yeah, those are the 3 changes I would make. If you find that you want more on-spot retire, then you can bump the grade 3 to 4, so essentially taking out Braccio Force or the Bernia. You can also change one of the fronts to a crit if you want to play more crit focused, but I think 4 fronts is really good. But also the quality of shield in this deck is really good too. If you're drawing into a front, you feel pretty good because you have 20k worth of shield. And especially against decks like Messiah, GANDEEVA, and some of the other decks coming out of set 10, quality of shield is actually really good. There is I guess, an opinion to kind of change the cycle card if you want to. I've rarely ever needed the cycle card. So actually in this deck, you have like 5 flex slots. So you have the cycle card, the grade 2s, and the grade 1. Those are the 5 slots that I would change. The grade 1 here is really, really good, but I know in Japan they run decks that don't run this grade 1. I would personally be against it, but I mean, if it works for you, then it works. And if you're only running one of the grade 1, you're ever only fighting it like once a game, which might only be like, you know, all you need for the game, especially if you're like focusing on the spot retires on the grade 3 mainly. And you know, because a lot of people don't actually run a lot of 3s other than in the mirror, you can actually afford to bump this up to 4 and then start dropping your grade 1 countercharger, because you have on-spot retire with this, and then that means your opponent has to hit a 3 of the top 5 to retire your grade 3. And essentially, if your board is full of multiple of the same grade, your opponent can only choose those many, like limited amount of units, because they can't choose duplicate units. So yeah, that's pretty much how the deck is built. And I feel that this deck is really strong. I've been playtesting it the last, you know, couple of weeks prior to, I guess, the set releasing. Very, very strong deck. So we'll just go through some of the play action for this deck. It's pretty easy. So essentially, let's just say this is as it is. So you're discarding 1 card and writing this. So if you find your cycle card, then, you know, you're a pretty good player. You only played 2. So essentially you're discarding this, and then you're Soul Blasting 1 to draw 1 to refund the cycler cost. But let's just say, you know, you're an ordinary player like me, and I never draw the cycle card. You're discarding 1 card to essentially write this. And the next turn, then you're free writing this, because a lot of people don't commit a board, or at least 2 units onto the board, unless they play Swirler GG. And if they do, then Swirler GG, you're writing this, and then you're calling this the front row. The important fact that you're in the front row, especially if you're going first, this is an 8k, a free 8k to the opponent's Vanguard. And you know, in this format we don't have heal guardians, so essentially they need to hit defensive and they can't guard with the units in the front. So yeah, that's pretty much how the early stages work. Now in terms of the cards that you can afford to drop, you can afford to drop Bernia. You can also afford to drop your multi-attacker, and obviously Braccio Force. Now, out of these 3, I think the cards that you don't really want to drop is this one, because multi-attack is always good and you only have 4 of it in the deck. So if, you know, 1 hits damage, 1 gets, I don't know, discarded somehow, 1 gets guarded with, yeah, then you have less options to multi-attack. So if you find these 2, you know, chuck them into front row regard, attack, and then attack. But let's just say, you know, your opponent Swirler GGs you, then you're dropping this in the front row, and then you're dropping one of these 2 in the front row, and then you're attacking. The good thing about Bernia is that if you're playing it in the front row, then you can promote it, well, push it back, and then like, you know, next turn play something else in the front, or like you're playing this in the front, right? So then you have like an L formation, and then like, let's just say if, you know, you had like your countercharger, for example, then you can keep this in the front, keep this at the back, then you're attacking with this first, right? And then this next, and then essentially your GANDEEVA Vanguard when you ride it. So essentially, then you proc this skill and then you essentially bind it, and then let's just say, you know, you call one or whatever. And then pretty much that means that this column's pretty buffed. You don't really want to attack with this because I think when you're on GANDEEVA, if your opponent rushes you and you somehow call out this card, then you're popping 2 of their units anyways. Or if like, you know, they only play the grade 1, then you're popping 1 and then you have an on-spot retire for the second one, which means that it's plus 4k. That means that this is 20. 20 hits over defensive against a grade 2, and that's really, really important. So essentially what you're going to be doing is like, you're going to be attacking this solo, and then attack with GANDEEVA, and then calling something else out, because you're binding this, and you know, obviously you're going to have like 2 more in the bind because you've on-spot retired twice. Then essentially these gain plus 6, and that's really, really important. Hitting over defensives is really, really strong. So yeah, that's like kind of like the main early game plan with this deck. Generally, if you play multiple Burnier, then you want to place 1 behind the Vanguard, and then you have your counter charges on the rear guard because you're essentially attacking with one side first, and then you essentially spin this to counter charge 1, and then spin this. Let's just say if that was like a multi-attacker or something, like your Alpha Car, and then yeah, you bind that and then you call on a unit. Now generally, the side that you want to place the counter charger is the side that you want to attack with first. And then let's just say you have multiple Burniers, then you put the Burniers on the other sides because that is pretty much the last 2 attacks that you go for. This deck only goes for 4 attacks on average. If you have double of this, then you can go for 5 attacks. But I think that is super, super wasteful unless you're, you know, going to your final turn. Then obviously, you know, you have 2 of these, attack, bind 2, call 2, and then you bash again. So yeah, that's pretty much the main game plan. Now in terms of, I guess, how this deck rolls into the metagame at the moment, the mirror is so important. The mirror, I think, is probably what decides you from making it to Worlds and not making it to Worlds, especially in the standard format, because there'll be a lot of GANDEEVA players come this next format. GANDEEVA is a very accessible deck, and it's probably one of the most impactful decks, if not the best deck in the format at the moment. There's also Willista coming out in the Festival collection, so Willista is also another deck to look out for. But the good thing about this deck is that you can start killing Willista's rear guards. So the restander for Willista is actually really important. The only problem with that is that Willista just draws heaps. So if you're trying to retire one and not the other, so you either keep their restand or they keep their draw engine, which is the grade 1. But otherwise, their order essentially means top 5 call 2. Which is pretty crazy. So yeah, Willista is also another deck you need to look out for. Jejuled Mask's grade 3 turn is actually pretty annoying because it's probably the strongest grade 3 turn in the game. They essentially get crit minus you to 1, and then essentially you have to guard against a crit, right? So this deck doesn't actually draw a lot early, and yeah, that's like one of the big issues with this deck. Other than that, pretty much when you get to grade 3 and you best harvest and you retire your opponent's whole field, your hand is fat. Like we're talking like 10 to 12 cards. So yeah, that's pretty much how the deck kind of goes into the metagame at the moment. Messiah is just Messiah. Yeah, so pretty much your units get locked and bound, but that works in your favor because, well, actually it doesn't. It doesn't really work in your favor, but I guess it doesn't feel too bad, the fact that your units get bound because you have a fat hand anyways, and then you're pretty much just recalling stuff out anyways. So yeah, how this deck, well, like what other things to note about this deck is that this deck is very, very flexible, and not a lot of people know just because like the deck list is very standardized, maybe cookie cutter. There's a lot of flex slots in this deck to start experimenting with some of the other cards, but I think some of the changes that I've noted in the start of the video and kind of what changes I would make those are the changes I would make and would experiment with, like, you know, 1 or 2 other cards once they come by. So yeah, this is pretty much the comprehensive guide for GANDEEVA. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know this is probably one of the most important deck profiles or the comprehensive guides I'll be releasing, you know, from now until the end of the year, because GANDEEVA is one of the strongest, or if not the strongest deck in the metagame, and you guys need to know all about it. If you guys like this video, pop a like, comment down below what you guys think of this deck and, you know, how your deck plays into this deck. Is it a favorable matchup for you? If you haven't subscribed, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.